If you struggle to find great scary podcasts, or are tired of the same old scary stories told by commercial creators, then maybe Scary Time is for you. Scary Time is a podcast that lets you hear a scary story from a different indie podcast each week. It promises the scariest stories, history and conversations you've ever heard. And according to the show description, each week, independent creators will tell you about the paranormal, ghosts, monsters, hauntings, creepy places, enchanted objects, aliens, and many more. If you want a new scary podcast, or several, head over to www.dummies.fan/murder and more. That's www.dummies.fan/murder and more for the creepiest stories you'll wish you've never heard. Warning: this episode contains description that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Hi guys, just to let you know that I have a promo of another podcast that I would love for you to listen to, playing at the very end of this episode, so please stay tuned until then. Hi M&Ms, welcome back to another episode of Murder and More. As always, I am your host, Kira. The 25th of May is International Missing Children's Day, first initiated by Ronald Reagan in 1983. And is in place to not only bring awareness to the thousands of missing children worldwide, but to also honour organisations who put up a daily fight for these missing children. Whilst most children run away of their own accord due to bullying or a poor family life, 1 in 5 are at risk of being sexually exploited. There are several charities based in the UK that work to support children and young adults. The Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre provide useful resources and advice to safeguard children against the dangers of sexual exploitation and online sexual abuse. Missing People is a well-known charity that works to support the families of people who have gone missing and also attempt to support the people who go missing too, by offering a listening ear if a child wants to confide in someone but doesn't trust or have anyone they can talk to. They try to provide advice to children who are considering going missing, but also act as a mediator for children who have run away and don't wish to talk to their families. Childline is run 24/7, provided by the NSPCC, and is a service to provide advice and guidance to children who are suffering from domestic violence, abuse, or who are considering running away from home. Blackpool is a beach town in the northwest of England, located on the Irish Sea coast in Lancashire. It's well known for the amusement park, known as Blackpool Pleasure Beach, the Blackpool Tower, which was inspired by the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and Blackpool Illuminations, an event that attracts numerous visitors between August and November, which consists of a series of light displays and collages across the 7 miles of seafront. The first few days of November 2003 were windy, wet and overcast. Grey clouds lingered low in the sky and winds gusted ferociously as 14-year-old Charlene Downes played on the arcades and ate at McDonald's with her sister Rebecca on the afternoon of Saturday the 1st of November. The girls were spotted on CCTV heading towards the arcades at 3:25 p.m, where they remained until 6:45 p.m. The pair left the arcades and bumped into their mother, Karen Downes, who was handing out leaflets for an Indian restaurant on a street nearby. After stopping to have a chat with their mother, Rebecca was ready to make her way home. However, despite it more than likely being virtually pitch black by this time, Charlene decided she wasn't ready to go home. She said goodbye to Karen, promising her she wouldn't be home late, and headed to a nearby phone box to call her friends. She waited with her mum until her friends arrived, and at about 8:30 p.m, the group of girls went off and hung out for about 20 minutes before parting ways. What occurred over the next hour is unknown, but Charlene's next known movements are at roughly 9:30, when Charlene met with another friend, and they hung out on Blackpool's North Pier at the Carousel Bar. At roughly 10 p.m, the girls left the pier and headed back towards the town centre and parted ways at about 11 p.m. From there, Charlene's movements are completely unknown. After 11 p.m. on the 1st of November 2003, Charlene Downes vanished. There have been no sightings of her since. At the time of her disappearance, Charlene was wearing black jeans that had a gold eagle on, a black jumper and black boots. Charlene Elizabeth Caroline Downes was born on the 25th of March 1989 to Karen and Robert Downes. The family, which consisted of Charlene, her parents, her brother and 2 sisters, moved to Blackpool when Charlene was 10 from the West Midlands. Charlene was a happy-go-lucky, bubbly child who loved music and animals and was described by friends and family as cheeky and just a typical teenager who loved her siblings. Despite loving life, Charlene had had a troubled childhood, and eventually her life spiralled downhill. She was expelled from school for truanting when she was just 13 years old and fell in with the wrong crowd, a crowd her mother was not content with her daughter being friends with, and banned from the house. When Charlene was 12 years old, she disappeared for 4 days, with it later being discovered that she'd stayed with a friend without informing her parents. This is why, when Charlene didn't return home on that cold Saturday night, her parents weren't concerned. They assumed she'd just lost track of time or crashed at a friend's. It wouldn't be until the Monday that Karen Downes finally reported her 14-year-old daughter missing to police. When they inquired as to why she hadn't informed them earlier, she insisted she'd phoned on the Sunday morning and was told to wait 24 hours. However, phone records and call logs have proved this to be untrue. The real reason why Karen Downes failed to report her daughter missing earlier may be much darker and more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Police interviewed around 3,000 people with regards to Charlene Downes' disappearance, and whilst it didn't provide any leads as to her location or fate, it did uncover a seedy underbelly of Blackpool that had been swept under the carpet for decades. Charlene Downes' disappearance unveiled abuse that had been going on in Blackpool for years, and whilst it was ignored for many years before she vanished, hidden under a veil of partying, this abuse and child sexual exploitation was a poorly kept secret. Blackpool is an extremely impoverished town, being the 12th poorest town in the UK. The number of children in Blackpool on the Child Protection Register is 16%, nearly double the national average. These children are either vulnerable to or are already experiencing abuse and child sexual exploitation. On top of this, underage and unprotected sex isn't uncommon, with 1 in 12 girls falling pregnant before their 18th birthday, and prostitution is rife in Blackpool. Runaway children, who are more than likely running away from abuse, are attracted to the bright lights of Blackpool, however completely unaware and naive to the sexual predators they will encounter once they are there. On average, there are 800 high-risk sex offenders living in Blackpool, which is just under 0.6% of its population. Naturally, these sex offenders will take advantage of the vulnerability of not just the young runaways, but the vulnerable children and teenagers that are under the care of social services and already suffering abuse at the hands of their families in Blackpool. A police report was conducted in 2007, which failed to surface until 2011, documenting the extreme sexual exploitation going on under the radar, or possibly simply being ignored in Blackpool. An article in the Daily Mail in 2011 details the disturbing and harrowing sexual exploitation that young teenage girls in Blackpool were facing. It's believed that roughly 60, mainly white, schoolgirls between the ages of 11 and 15 were being targeted by a largely Asian community of staff in around 11 fast food establishments around Blackpool. It's strongly believed that Charlene Downes was one of these many girls who were offered food, alcohol and cigarettes by the men in return for sexual favours. Most of this horrific and unimaginable abuse occurred in a location known as Packy Alley near Talbot Road, interestingly not far from where Charlene was last seen. Vulnerable children were much more at risk of being targeted, for example children who were in care homes or whose home lives may not have been as stable, safe or happy. Charlene's childhood on the outside wasn't an unhappy one. However, it would later come to light that the Downes family was known to social services as a result of continued child protection concerns, and Charlene was identified as vulnerable to sexual exploitation before they moved to Blackpool. Ray Munro was a friend of Charlene's father, whom he'd met whilst he was out drinking. Ray was a convicted paedophile and living at the Downes house at the time of Charlene's disappearance, with Charlene's father Bob insisting he had no idea that Ray had pleaded guilty to such crimes. Quote, "I didn't know at the time, otherwise I would never have had him in the house," end quote, Karen Downes stated. 3 days after Charlene's disappearance, Ray Munro appeared in court where he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of indecent assault and 1 of exposure against 3 girls and indecently assaulting a 6-year-old boy. For these offences, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Another friend of Bob's, Glenn, told the makers of the 3-part documentary, The Murder of Charlene Downes, quote, "I saw Charlene sitting on Munro's lap once. I just didn't think it was right for a young girl like that sitting on his lap. I thought that's not right because she's just a 14-year-old kid. I just had a word with him," end quote. This episode was made possible by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to begin monetizing your podcast, whether you're big or small. Podgo provides podcasters with a flat rate for ad space, so you always know how much you get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today at podgo.co to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co. The Times suggested in November 2013 that Charlene's sexual abuse had actually begun in her home, in the place she should have felt the safest. A hospital report made when Charlene was just 11-year-old identified signs of sexual abuse. Police stated they believed Charlene Downes was potentially abused by as many as 100 men prior to her disappearance. An article written by the Daily Mail in 2019 suggests that Ray Munro wasn't the only sex offender that would frequent the Downes home, and even suggests that Charlene herself had reported some of her father's acquaintances, all of whom he'd meet down the pub, to social services for inappropriate sexual behaviour. Journalist Julie Bindel told the Daily Mail, quote, "I heard this story too many times from people who seemed to care about what happened to Charlene, that there was a lot of violence going on in the household, and not just from outsiders that Bob brought in from the pub." End quote. As a result of the more than likely prolonged sexual abuse occurring within the Downes home, just 8 days after her disappearance, the police had already made the decision that if Charlene were to be found alive, she would not be returned home and would instead be placed under a police protection order. Under Section 46 of the Children Act 1989, quote, "Where a constable has reasonable cause to believe that a child would otherwise be likely to suffer significant harm, he may remove the child to suitable accommodation and keep him there." End quote. Subsection 3 of Section 46 states that the constable must then inform the local authority in which the child was found, and, if different, the local authority in which the child usually resides, of the steps that have been taken and the reasons for taking them. In 2006, Charlene's disappearance was finally being treated as a murder inquiry, which saw 2 men become suspects in her abuse and murder. The 2 men were 29-year-old Ayad Albatiki, originally from Jordan, who owned the local fast food restaurant Funny Boys, one of the establishments involved in the sexual exploitation of many young teenage girls. Ayad was described by a local takeaway owner, Michael Kearns, as a brash, arrogant, volatile predator. The second suspect was Ayad's business partner, 49-year-old Mohammed Raveshi from Iran. Mohammed was a former army sergeant, a landlord of 42 properties, as well as Ayad's business partner at the fast food restaurant in Blackpool. The 2 men were identified by David Cassidy, a local business owner. The men were taken to the police station for informal interviews primarily, and whilst these were taking place, police placed covert surveillance in Mohammed's home and car, which began recording as soon as they left the station. This surveillance lasted 4 weeks in total and provided police with 52 tapes of Raveshi and Albatiki talking. An in-depth forensic search was also performed on one of the houses Mohammed owned, however nothing was found. Sergeant Jan Besant was tasked with transcribing the covert surveillance tapes, which eventually secured Ayad and Mohammed being charged with Charlene's murder. The trial for the 2 men began in 2007, where all of this evidence was presented to the jury, who were told of 10 separate incidents that Ayad and Mohammed were involved in that concerned girls between the ages of 13 and 15. Whilst police were covertly monitoring Ayad and Mohammed, a woman went to them with a serious accusation against Ayad Albatiki. Whilst police knew Albatiki had raped the woman, as he had apparently filmed it, the charges against him were dropped and the case was never taken to trial. The prosecution accused Ayad of sexually assaulting Charlene and then being the one to go on and murder her afterwards, and Mohammed was accused of disposing of her body. This accusation was corroborated after Mohammed could be heard on the covert surveillance in his home, explaining how Charlene's body had been chopped up and, quote, gone into kebabs, end quote. Furthermore, Ayad was heard saying he was unable to forgive himself. However, the issue he could not forgive himself for was never confirmed. Later, Mohammed was heard asking how long fingerprints last, with Ayad reassuring him that there was nothing left of Charlene. Unfortunately, the jury failed to reach a verdict in the murder case, and a retrial was set for 2008. To this day, Mohammed denies having any knowledge of Charlene's disappearance, and even denies knowing Charlene at all. The 2008 retrial never took place, as senior police officers from Lancashire Police raised concerns about the covert surveillance. Subsequently, the CPS found no evidence implicating Ayad al-Batiki or Mohammed Raveshi in Charlene's murder, and both men were paid £250,000 in compensation. The Independent Police Complaints Commission investigated the case, spanning across 18 months, which concluded on the 15th of October 2019. This investigation found that the investigating team were, quote, guilty of a strategic and tactical failure in the management of the material, end quote, with IPCC Commissioner for the North West, Nassim Malik, stating that it was, quote, abundantly clear that the court surveillance was handled poorly and unprofessionally, end quote. The investigation stated that a person living in the house, bugged by police, hadn't been debriefed adequately. Additionally, the IPCC found that the officers who had worked on the case were, quote, inexperienced and untrained, end quote. And finally, the conversations between Ayad and Mohammed hadn't been correctly transcribed, which saw the detective responsible for transcribing the tapes, Sergeant Jan Besant, being ordered to resign after being found guilty of 2 counts of misconduct in December 2011. Detective Chief Superintendent Andy Webster leads the investigation into Charlene's disappearance, and after the trial, he addressed not only Charlene's disappearance, but the wider issue of child sexual exploitation occurring in Blackpool. Quote, we remain committed to finding Charlene's killer or killers and her body, despite it being more than 15 years since she went missing. A £100,000 reward remains on offer for information leading to the conviction of her killer or killers or recovery of her body. We will continue to not only focus on her disappearance and murder, but also on the wider issue of child sexual exploitation in Blackpool, for which we have now secured a number of successful convictions. I would encourage anyone who knows anything about Charlene's disappearance and death to come forward and speak to us. Similarly, if you have been a victim of child abuse, please speak to the police. We will listen to you, support you, and bring offenders to justice. End quote. The police believe that the £100,000 is a life-changing amount of money, but more importantly, that someone out there holds the key to solving Charlene's disappearance. On the 13th anniversary of Charlene's disappearance, police renewed their appeal for information and released CCTV footage of her walking with her sister Rebecca on the day she disappeared. In 2016, Detective Chief Superintendent Andy Webster said of the previously unseen footage, quote, it has been 13 years since Charlene disappeared, but we are as determined as ever to find her killer or killers. Hopefully these pictures of Charlene on the day she disappeared will help jog someone's memory, and I would urge anyone with information, however insignificant they feel it may be, to come and speak to us. I have always been convinced that there are people who know what happened to Charlene, but have not yet come forward to speak to the police. As part of the inquiries, we are also focusing on the wider issue of child sexual exploitation in Blackpool at around the time of Charlene's disappearance, and we have identified a number of people who could potentially be victims and offenders, and we will be seeking to make arrests and to prosecute abusers in the near future. End quote. Charlene's disappearance, as Lancashire's longest-running murder investigation, with more than 4,800 witness statements being taken and over 10,500 lines of inquiry being generated, all to no effect. Charlene's disappearance is still as much of a mystery as it was 17 years ago. Charlene's family, her friends, and the people of Blackpool will forever be haunted by the 14-year-old girl who fell prey to sexual abusers, a young teenage girl who vanished into thin air one dark, cold evening in 2003. Charlene is missed terribly by her family, a family who are begging for anyone with information to come forward. If you have any information relating to Charlene's whereabouts or murder, police and I urge you to phone 101, quoting log number LC 20161031, or by contacting Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111. You can also fill out an online Crime Stoppers form, which I will link to in my show notes and on my website. Let's end the most mystifying disappearance Blackpool has seen in many, many years. Charlene was just an innocent 14-year-old girl who deserves justice. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to head over to Apple Podcasts to leave a rating and review, and Patreon to consider becoming a patron of Murder and More. As a patron, for just $2 a month, you get access to episodes early and ad-free, and you get a sticker sent to you. The link to my Patreon can be found in my show notes. To interact with us, you can follow us on Twitter and Tumblr at Murder and More, Instagram at Murder and More Pod, and Facebook at Murder and More Podcast. To view the sources and pictures for this episode, head over to www.murderandmorepodcast.wordpress.com. Have an amazing few weeks, stay safe, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks for another episode.
Hi guys, this is Julia, the host of Always Time for True Crime. Each week, I cover a different case about murder, missing persons, or serial killers. My podcast strives to bring attention to lesser-known cases and give you guys some new true crime stories. So go give it a listen. You can listen to Always Time for True Crime on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher, and more.